This is Thomas Hardy in under 5 minutes, and no, not Tom Hardy as in the guy who played Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. Thomas Hardy, the English poet and novelist from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now, let's get straight into the facts. He was born in 1840 to Thomas and Jemima Hardy in Higher Brockhampton of Dorset, England. His father Thomas was a country musician and ballad writer. He learned in his younger years about the ballad form, which would influence his style of poetry later in his life. He became an apprentice to an architect in his teenage years. He would spend quite a bit of time in this profession through his teens and early 20s. In his early 20s, Hardy began to take up an interest in writing. He began as a novelist, and he had some early failures. His early novels were not accepted as they either had no plot or they did not have enough detail. He attempted to write a novel without a plot, but this was shot down because it wouldn't be popular enough to publish. He took influence from George Eliot, but did not have as strong a religious belief, being agnostic from birth. He explored human conflict as a main topic of writing early on in his career. His first style of writing was romance, but he moved on to tragedy. He believed that in order to entice the reader, the plot should be different than a normal person's life. He then started to become successful, and his wife started to become jealous. She then left him, and he became depressed as a result. This depression caused him to make a switch in genres to poetry. Hardy's wife died not long after the divorce, and he wrote many lyrical poems about her. At this point in his life, he began to develop his poetry style. He used action to grab a reader's attention, and used the ballad structure in many poems. He was a very negative writer, and many people called him a pessimist. He wrote books of poems, many of which were about his wife. He also wrote an epic poem about the Napoleonic era. Hardy wrote poetry for most of his remaining life. He married his secretary, but still loved his first wife. He died on January 11, 1928. He asked that his heart be buried in his wife's grave. It was a very odd request, but he had his reasons for it. He had loved her, and it was a major impact on his writing. On that note, let's take a look at some of his poetry. We will be looking at a poem of his called The Going, which was written about his wife leaving him. Let's take a look at the first stanza. Why did you give no hint that night, that quickly after the morrow's dawn, and calmly, as if indifferent quite, you would close your term here, up and be gone, where I could not follow, with wing of swallow, to gain one glimpse of you ever anon? He writes based on emotion, which can be seen here. This is one of many that he wrote about his wife. He follows a 1-2-1-2-3-3-2 rhyme scheme. He does not use couplets as is common, and creates this rhyme scheme to be unique. Let's take a look at the second stanza. Never to bid goodbye, or lit me the softest call, or utter a wish for a word, while I saw morning hardened upon the wall, unmoved, unknowing that your great going had placed that moment and altered all. An important thing to note is that he doesn't follow any sort of syllabic structure, and it plays into the influence of the ballad form on his poetry. Let's go through the rest of the poem. Why do you make me leave the house, and think for a breath it is you I see, at the end of the alley of bending boughs, where so often at dusk you used to be, till in darkening dankness, the yawning blankness of the perspective sickens me. You were she who abode by those red-veined rocks far west. You were the swan-necked one who rode along the beetling beany crest, and reigning nigh me would muse and eye me when life unrolled us at its very best. Why, then, latterly did we not speak? Did we not think of those days long dead, and ere your vanishing strive to seek that time's renewal? We might have said, in this bright spring weather we'll visit together those places that we once visited. Well, well, all pasts amend, unchangeable it must go. I seem but a dead man held on end, to sink down soon. Oh, you could not know that such swift fleeing, no soul foreseeing, not even I, would undo me so. Obviously, this poem is based very heavily on emotion. Hardy uses phrases like, well, well, all's past amend, as a way to convey his emotion. As mentioned earlier, he loved his wife very much, and this was one of the many tributes to her. Going back to talking about the ballad format, this poem is a very good example of the influence. He tells a story using poetry in his own unique way. This is one of the reasons why Thomas Hardy is such a good poet. He was able to use his experience as a novel writer to create his own version of different styles of poetry, and became popular through it. Hardy was a well-received poet, and critics enjoyed his use of emotion created through his diction and imagery. Critics also enjoyed his structure as it was different and used an interesting rhyme scheme. Thomas Hardy had quite an interesting life. From starting off learning about ballads from his father to completely switching genres in the middle of his career, he managed to create great poetry using a different style that adds in another layer of interest. This was Thomas Hardy in under 5 minutes. I hope you enjoyed and consider checking out some of his poetry.